Hey everybody, Professor Dust here. For this module, we're going to talk about individual characteristics. So organizational behavior is about the study of people. So let's really dive in and start thinking about how might we categorize the way that people operate, the way that people act, the way that people behave within an organizational setting. So let's get started. First off, you can evaluate individuals based upon their demographics. And these demographics typically are things that are observable, at least to some degree, right? So typically we have a relatively accurate guess on what somebody's gender, ethnicity, age might be. And so those demographics are all important for a variety of different reasons. Number one, in terms of equity, diversity, inclusion, we need to be paying attention to these different types of demographic characteristics. And as well, we need to be paying attention to these things, not just from the fairness standpoint, but also from a performance standpoint. As we'll talk about later, it is really important to have people that come from different places and have different viewpoints from a demographic perspective, because that makes sure that we have more well-rounded thinking about our customers and about our options, right? So those are all beneficial. But demographics can also get us into trouble, because a lot of times when we observe something, when we see something, we are going to overgeneralize based upon what we see. And this is a form of cognitive bias. And that's particularly problematic for a variety of different reasons. One, fairness, right? If we're assuming that a certain person of a certain minority, for example, is going to act a certain way, that's problematic. Or a majority is going to act a certain way, that's problematic. But then also when the individual of this specific subgroup or this minority group starts to believe in whatever this stereotype is, particularly if it's something that is detrimental, they start believing in it to the degree that they change their behavior and that they're enacting what actually is the stereotype. So classic example, they did this, they being a group of researchers decades ago, did this wonderful experiment where they gave a control group and an experimental group a math test. And so at the time, there was this problem where there was way more men in STEM than there were women. And so they were trying to get a handle on why and what's going on. And maybe this is just the way we were built, or is this just the way that we assume things? Well, it's definitely way more about our assumptions than it is about reality. So what they did was, in the control group, they didn't say anything fancy. They just gave them this math test and said, go for it. In the other group, in the experimental group, they primed everybody with a line that essentially said, and this was embedded within a paragraph of explanation, that males typically do better than females on these types of math tests. And sure enough, the males did much better than the females in the math test in the experimental group. In the control group, there was no difference at all. Actually, there was a very, very, very small difference. The females actually did slightly better than the males. So this is stereotype at its finest, right? When we think, or stereotype threat at its finest. When we think that something's accurate based upon a generalization, then we begin to believe it, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So demographics are important, but at the same time, we also need to pay attention to the fact that sometimes we're programmed when we see people's demographics to think a certain way, and that's not helpful. So another way that we can think about individual characteristics is looking at personality traits. So personality traits entail consistent behavior across time, right? So if you act this way now, you're probably going to act this way tomorrow, a year from now, 10 years from now. No, it's never perfect. Of course, there's a little bit of change in our personality over time, but for the most part, it's very stable. And in addition to that, it's pretty much the same across situations, right? So whether you're at home, whether you're at work, whether with your friends, whether it's with people you don't know, or whatever it might be. So that's what a trait is getting at, this tendency to behave in a certain way consistently over time. So by far the most popular framework for understanding traits or personality traits is the Big Five. You've probably heard all these before, but before I go into examples of what each one is, I think it's important to keep in mind what the purpose of this specific model is. Okay, so the Big Five could have very well been the Big Three or the Big 10. What researchers were trying to do was say, okay, of all the potential behaviors that are out there for people, let's distill it down to as many themes as possible that are as representative as possible of all the different behaviors, right? So it was this balancing act of specificity versus applicability, right? Are we covering as much of the possible traits as possible? And so they, after all these different analyses and all these different samples and across cultures and across genders, and made sure that it was widely and universally applicable, they distilled personality traits down to the big five. And so essentially, you could have any type of behavior and it could be plugged in to some degree one of these big five traits, right? So that was the goal. But keep in mind, right, that there's other types of frameworks out there that evaluate personality. This is just one of them, but it is by far the most well-researched, the most widely reliable and valid approach to getting at personality traits. So the first one being extroversion, and this is the degree to which we are sociable, the degree to which we're outgoing, the degree to which we recharge our battery by interacting and working with others. And then on the other end of the continuum, or low extroversion, would be introversion, right? People that are a little bit more reserved, they like to think first before they speak. They recharge their battery by being alone. And then the next one is neuroticism. So those that are high in neuroticism, they tend to be relatively emotional. They tend to be perfectionists. They want things to be under control. They want it just so. And then on the low end, low neuroticism has also been kind of the reverse wording has been applied of emotional stability, right? So actually neuroticism, sometimes people don't like to think of themselves as neurotics. They'd prefer to think of themselves as low on emotional stability, but it's the inverse, right? So emotional stability is more about to be able to remain calm and be more logical given the face of uncertainty, and a little bit more ability to kind of go with the flow. Agreeableness is about this desire for harmony, for people to work together well, it's for nobody to be mad at each other. And those that are low on agreeableness, or they're more disagreeable, they enjoy that conflict, that controversy. They like to flesh things out. They're not afraid to speak their mind and have a little bit of angst in there, a little bit of conflict to kind of search out the truth, right? And this is a really good reminder of the fact that, none of these are good or bad, right? Introverts have things that extroverts can't do and vice versa. Being a perfectionist in some cases is great. So being a high neurotic can be beneficial in some scenarios, as can be being more emotionally stable. Same with agreeableness and disagreeableness, right? You want people that are going to be warm and welcoming and seek harmony, but you also want people that are willing to say, let's really battle this out and come up with some creative solutions and be that disagreeable person or the devil's advocate. And then conscientiousness, this one's a little bit different in that, conscientiousness is always good. The low end of conscientiousness is never a good thing, but high consciousness is always a good thing. So they're more organized, they're more dependable. If they say they're going to do it, they get it done. They follow up. They make sure that everything's going to work out well by thinking through all the different situations and nuances. Conscientious in people really is kind of the holy grail in terms of a performer at work. You really want people that are conscientious. And then the last one is openness to experience. So those that are high on openness to experience, they're more open-minded. They tend to be a little more creative. They like to think abstractly, where those that are low on openness to experience, they like to have a little bit more control. They like things to be a little more specific, and they kind of like to follow formulas. And there's some benefits to that too, right? People that kind of make sure they go through the steps and do things within a routine, and that makes things potentially more efficient. All right, so that's the big five in a nutshell. A few big takeaways to think about. Number one, understand that for the majority of these, except conscientiousness, being low or high isn't necessarily good or bad. It just depends on the circumstances. Specific to leadership, a few interesting statistics is conscientiousness is the best trait in terms of predicting leadership effectiveness. Then the best predictor of leadership emergence, right? Those that emerge to the top in a group of peers in terms of leadership is extroversion, which kind of makes sense, right? The one that's willing to speak up, the one that's willing to take charge and influence and talk to everybody, right? So it's important to kind of know the difference, right? The best leaders in terms of performance usually are those that are more conscientious, those that typically rise to the top because we either think they should be leaders or because they're willing to speak up and lead, end up being the extroverts. So here's a key question that I want to offer as a way to kind of frame personality characteristics from a contingency-based perspective is to think about this. Which one is worse? The individual on your team, perhaps, that is very high in agreeableness, the office hugger, the office high-fiver who wants everybody to get along, wants to really make sure everybody is high on harmony, versus the very high neurotic, right? The person that is just like over the top, has to have it correct, and that person is a perfectionist and really holds everybody accountable and is constantly checking in on you and just kind of drives you nuts. So if you really think about it, it really does depend on which one is worse, or said differently, which one is better, right? The high agreeableness person, they're more likely to actually be perpetuating groupthink, right? Oh, we just want everybody to get along. Sure, everybody's okay with this, and they kind of satisfice, and they just want to move on and make sure everybody is happy, which isn't the same thing as making sure that everybody is productive or doing what they're supposed to be doing in terms of making something productive. Then on the other hand, with high neurotics, if you really have somebody that is over the top in terms of neuroticism or very high on neuroticism, it can be challenging, right? It might create angst within the group. It might kind of create divisions between who's aligned and who's not aligned, because some people like it and some people don't. But at the same time, in some industries and in some jobs, it's kind of nice to have somebody who is an absolute perfectionist and wants to get it right every single time, because, hey, quality matters in the business world, right? So you have to think about the pros and cons of any type of teammate in your environment, right? It might depend upon the job. It might depend upon the industry, right? Is it fast moving or is it slower? It might depend upon the makeup of the people, right? Maybe the group has thick skin and they can handle somebody that's a neurotic. Maybe the group has enough disagreeable or moderately agreeable, disagreeable people to handle somebody who's just seeking out harmony. It really depends upon the group at large. A few other important personality traits specific to the workplace I'm going to cover next. So we've talked about the big five, which again, the goal was to kind of be broad and cover all of the different personality traits to make sure they're all hit within one framework. What we're talking about now are specific types of personality traits that might have some correlations with some of those big fives and some don't. But thinking about it from a little bit more of a narrow perspective on what exactly what exactly is this specific trait related to in terms of workplace outcomes. One really popular one is called Locus of Control. Your locus of control, it's a continuum. It could be internal or it could be external. When events are internal, you feel as if these events that happen within your life are under your control. You do have an influence on the outcome. When people are high on the external side of locus of control, they kind of say, hey, I'm a leaf blowing in the wind. It doesn't really matter what I do. It doesn't matter what I say. Things are going to happen regardless of my influence. And so the research is pretty clear that internal locus of control is more helpful for a variety of different workplace outcomes. So those that have an internal locus of control have higher job satisfaction. They tend to be higher performers. They're more committed to their organizations. They tend to have higher task performance as well as citizenship behaviors. So it is better in terms of looking for candidates or in terms of developing leaders to find people that do have a sense of control, a sense of agency to say, yes, things that I do matter. Another one is this tolerance for ambiguity. We've heard for a long, long time, globalization, technology, fragmentation of industries, things are more complicated than they've ever been before. And so this tolerance for ambiguity trait has been studied a lot as of late to say, given all of the circumstances in our environment and how fast things move and how crazy things are, Are people better or worse at being able to handle that ambiguity? And so those that are high on tolerance for ambiguity, they view ambiguity as an opportunity to learn, an opportunity to develop, or just this is just the way it is, and I've got to figure out how to get it done. Where those that are lower on tolerance for ambiguity, they really prefer to have more structure. They prefer to know exactly what step 1, 2, and 3 are. And so as leaders and managers, we need to recognize that so that we can plug people into the right type of work to make sure that they're in alignment for their tolerance for ambiguity with the job at hand. But at the same time, it's something that, depending upon the industry, you should be focusing on in terms of leadership development and personal development and growth, because the signs are showing that it's not getting less ambiguous, it's getting more ambiguous over time, right? So that's something we should think about working on. Another one is type A versus type B. So type A's are those that they're always engaged in something productive, right? Every minute of their day needs to be scheduled. They're always working towards new goals and new initiatives. Everything has a purpose. Everything they do is supposed to be productive. Or type B, a little bit more relaxed, easygoing. And again, both of them can be productive. Type A's get a lot done, and type A's make things happen, and that's great. But they also can be very intense. B's, a lot of times, can, similar to this idea of being agreeable on that personality trait, they're a little bit more relaxed, a little more easygoing. They make people feel comfortable. They help people have fun. They help people kind of see the big picture because, let's keep everything in perspective here. So type Bs as well are beneficial for teams or beneficial in organizations as well. Machiavellianism is a great example of one of the 3 personality traits that's part of what's called the dark triad. So people have been studying positive personality traits in the workplace for a long, long time. But about 20 years ago or so, there was a lot of attention being given to detrimental personality traits, because a lot of people were just kind of overlooking the fact that, it can be just as helpful for your organization to screen out or get rid of the bad personality types as it can be to try and work on some of the good personality types. So Machiavellianism, it's a strategy for dealing with people. And the strategy behind it is relatively manipulative. They do whatever it takes at all costs to get done what is in their best interest. And so it can be problematic, especially in the long term, right? They might be able to get things done in the short term, but once they cross your path, you might be taken advantage of, or they might be doing things that aren't necessarily in the best interest of everybody involved. Some of the other dark triad traits, narcissism, and then psychopathy are the other big 2. But just know that, there are personality traits out there that research is illustrating are things that we have to look out for and might be kind of hard to uncover when going through like a screening or application process and trying to decide who to hire and who to develop. To wrap up the personality trait portion of the presentation is this theory called the role of the situation. And in the role of the situation, it is a continuum, but to frame it as a dichotomous, you could have strong situations, and then you can also have weak situations. So in strong situations, the personality of the individual, it's less likely to be noticeable. It's less likely to shine. It's less likely to manifest in the way that individual prefers. Where in weak situations, it's the opposite. It is a little bit more organic in that people can let their true self be, right? I can really be the introvert that I am. I can really be the neurotic that I am. So just as an example, there's one way to talk about organizational structure that talks about mechanistic organizations versus organic organizations. Within mechanistic organizations, tons of rules, tons of policies, really clear on what you're supposed to do on a daily basis. And then on the opposite end, you have organic organizations where it's decentralized. There are a lot of opportunities for you to do whatever you think makes the most sense, a lot of autonomy. And in those situations, it's weak, right? So the environment you're embedded within might dictate the degree to which those behaviors that you should be exhibiting, given who you are in terms of personality traits, has the opportunity to present itself. So strong situations might mute those behaviors, where weak situations might enhance those behaviors or let those behaviors be what they traditionally are, right? Okay, so we talked about the big five, and there's those five characteristics and how it's well validated, and it's by far the most popular within social science. If you don't use the big five for peer-reviewed journal articles about personality, you're pretty much guaranteed it's going to be a hard time getting it published because it's so well established for all this research. On the other end, you have the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which is a personality typology, right? It's not looking at one trait at a time. It's creating a typology, and it's based upon four different dimensions: extroversion versus introversion, right? And this isn't a continuum in this case like we had with the big five. It's you are categorized as one or the other. And then it goes through these others: sensor versus intuitives, thinkers versus feelers, judges versus perceivers. Now, you've probably heard of it, and you've probably done some of this, whether through some development activity or some team building activity, or maybe just for fun. But it has a very different purpose. It has a very different model. And it's typically used as a team building exercise or as a conversation starter, so that people get to know themselves or their colleagues a little bit better. So two very different audiences: academic versus practitioner, or maybe just as a conversation starter. And so what I want to do is show you these slides, let you do your own Myers-Briggs typology. And then the discussion question, which I'll show you here in a second, is going to be comparing and contrasting big five versus the 16 types. So here's the one of potential 16 types that you might classify yourself into based upon the answers to some of these questions. So pause your screen as I go through these next four slides, and all you need to do is read it, decide whether you are an E or whether you are an I, and then do the same for the next three. So decide after reading these questions whether you're an E or an I. Next, we have sensor versus intuitive, so an S or an N. Just write down S or N. I'll give you a second. Next is thinker versus feeler. So all you need to write down is T or F based upon your answers to the questions. I'll give you a second to pause. Next, finally, is judger versus perceiver, J versus P. I'll give you a second to write down your scores. Okay, so now you should have your four scores, and now you should have a little bit of a title here for what you are. I am a INTJ. I am a scientist, which is no surprise. As a researching academic, that does not surprise me at all. So what I want you to do in your online discussion is answer these few questions. Number one, how are the big five in the MBTI, or the 16 types, similar and different? Okay, talk about that first. Next, talk about the pros and the cons of the big five, and talk about the pros and the cons of the MBTI. Okay, so I'm not going to give any hints. I'll leave it at that based upon what you've written. Have some good dialogue, constructive dialogue for pros and cons, regardless of where you currently stand on big five and MBTI. You should be able to have a thoughtful discussion about pros and cons. Apply that contingency perspective, okay? Okay, so let's talk about a few more individual characteristics. The next one is intelligence. So general mental ability, or our G score, is it's three different categories of how we acquire, process, and apply information, right? So our intelligence is this general mental ability that takes us through multiple steps. So our ability to acquire information, right? So if you were to read 100 pages, how much of that did you retain and remember? Okay. The next step is processing, right? Were you able to connect the dots, understand the themes, put it all together in your mind in a way that is helpful and organized? And then the next step is apply it. Okay, so based upon whatever it is, can you apply what you have now acquired and processed into a specific situation that makes sense? So those three steps, right? You could look at each one of those steps individually, but together that is general mental ability. And so we assess general mental ability all the time within organizational settings. Perhaps the most popular way to assess intelligence or general mental ability is through what's called a Wonderlic test. That's kind of like the SAT or ACT type questions. It's got some logic, it's got some math or something like that. And it's used by organizations all over the place as a way to get a general idea of how smart people are or how intelligent people are. Interestingly, the NFL also does it as well, right? So, of course, being a professional athlete, being a football player, it's very physical. You got to be able to run fast and jump high, and how much can you lift and how much can you squat. But they also have every player do a Wonderlic test to get a general idea of their intelligence. Um, and it's really interesting. You can look this up online and see the scores of players that have taken the Wonderlic test. And you can rank order them by position. You can rank order them just by straight up by individual. And so you start to see some interesting themes of different positions in particular. So what was fascinating to me is offensive linemen are actually, on average, the highest in terms of Wonderlic scores, meaning that our offensive linemen are some of the most intelligent people on the football field. And part of that is because on the fly, they have to decide who they're going to block or how they're going to make moves. And a lot of times they have to audible on the fly without being able to see, or audible being they change whatever the play is, whatever the quarterback decided to do last minute. They have to do that on the fly. So they're some of the smartest players. Quarterbacks typically are second, and then it kind of just depends after that. So interesting examples. I used to do this when I was a manager at our organization. It was more of an organizational thing they wanted us to do for every new hire that came in. We'd give them like a really short Wonderlic test, like 20 questions, and they would freak out because they haven't answered questions like this since they were in high school. And a lot of times all we were trying to do was see if they at least were applying good logic and they weren't completely missing the boat on, doing simple math and stuff like that. But we did use it to some degree as a screening tool. Another form of intelligence is called emotional intelligence, or EQ, and it has 5 dimensions, and we'll walk through what these dimensions are. And emotional intelligence has been investigated a lot, surprisingly, but it also has some haters. And part of that is because the way that emotional intelligence was studied, or it has been studied by some camps, was wrong. It was incorrect. So a lot of times what people were doing was just asking people to rate themselves on their emotional intelligence. Well, that kind of flies in the face of the logic behind it. You can't ask somebody how emotionally intelligent they are, because if they're not emotionally intelligent, they're not being accurate with their ratings. So what they started doing was there's something called the Mesquite emotional intelligence test. There are ways to have people fill out surveys. It's a little bit more of a problem set type of format, and you let them fill it out, and then you compare it against a normative sample for how other people did, so that they're not actually rating themselves. They're engaging in some type of emotionally intelligent logic that then can be compared against the norm. And so research is suggesting that, yes, emotional intelligence is super important, specifically in the workplace and dealing with others. And so here's how to break it down in terms of the 5 dimensions. The first one is self-awareness. Just, are you aware of what you're feeling, right? Can I tell when I'm a little anxious? Can I tell when I'm bored, right? To be self-aware of how you're feeling, what emotions you're experiencing in that moment. Self-motivation being, are you persistent in the face of obstacles? Some super interesting research is showing that when it comes to motivation, it actually is so incredibly closely tied to our emotions that really nothing else matters. So if you feel like you're unmotivated, really what it comes down to a lot of the time is managing our emotions in that moment. And emotions are fleeting and they can change. So if you set yourself up in ways that manage your emotions, you're actually helping yourself be more productive through higher motivation. Another one is self-management. So this is managing our emotions or impulses. And we've all been in those scenarios where something intense happens, something bad happens, and how do you react, right? So there's a great quote I love. Our happiness lies in our space between stimulus and response. This is what self-management is all about, right? So you had a bad stimulus, something unfortunate happened, but what is the degree to which you were able to manage those impulses and those reactions? The other 2 are a little bit more about the dyad, how you interact with others. So empathy is the ability to sense how others are feeling. I remember when I worked one time, and I would always ask the administrative assistant who worked for a specific senior level colleague. I would ask. They were very empathetic, and they were very in tune with the emotions of their boss. And if I needed to talk to their boss, who was a little temperamental, I would say, red light, yellow light, green light. What's going on with this person today? And he was so in tune with how that person was feeling that day. So he was empathetic. And then next is social skills. So your instincts in terms of being able to handle the emotions of others. Right? Do you acknowledge when people are feeling a certain way, and do you know how to act appropriately, giving the emotions that you are seeing somebody else witness? Okay, so that is emotional intelligence. We can also evaluate individual characteristics in terms of values. So what are values? They can be categorized in two different ways. First are desirable end states, and second are instrumental values. So these terminal values or desirable end states is, this is what I feel like I want to get to. This is the end goal. I feel like everybody should be prosperous, or everybody should be happy, being two examples. Now, ways of behaving are kind of like, how did I get to whatever those terminal values are? So I believe in doing everything honestly. I believe in working hard, or having ambition and reaching whatever this end state might be. So our values drive both. They drive our end goals as well as the way that we reach those end goals. So by far the most popular framework for values is Schwartz's 10 universal values, right? So kind of took all of the potential values that are out there in the world and distilled them into 10 themes that could then be evaluated. And then there's been some work versions of those specific values. But here's just a list of some of the things that people might evaluate. I like that it's a little bit more robust, and you could kind of find themes within this big list and maybe then categorize them into Schwartz's 10 universal values. So here's just a list that you might do in some kind of leadership or teams development type exercise to say, what's important to you? Because that's what values really are. What is important to you? And values, interestingly, are more complicated. And then a lot of times they need to be rank ordered, because you might value almost everything on this list to some degree. But what really matters is when the rubber hits the road and you're forced to decide between value 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? How do you rank order the values is more important than understanding which ones you value, right? So when I first graduated, I did this exact exercise with this exact list. And I said, I value achievement. I value autonomy. Right? I want lots of discretion in whatever I do. And I value wealth. And this made sense for that specific phase of my life, right? I was very driven to get good grades, and I wanted to get an MBA, and I wanted to be successful in my career. I didn't really like working for other people, and I like to be autonomous, and I still do. And then I was interested in wealth, meaning more so I just wanted to be financially independent and not have to have my parents pay for my room and board anymore. Now, these are still relatively important values for me, but as I've aged, now it's a little bit different, right? I have a family, and so that's an important value for me. I believe in growth, which is kind of a slightly different version of achievement. I want to achieve for the sake of learning and for the sake of improving and to make myself have more opportunities in the future. But it's not so much about just getting the A. It's a little bit more about learning for the sake of learning. And then wealth has transitioned a little bit more to not just be about, a number in the bank account. Now that I am financially independent, I have been a few years after I graduated, it's more about stability, right? I don't want necessarily, I just don't want to go bankrupt, right? I want to make sure I can always provide for my family. So the important part of this conversation is that values typically are relatively enduring, right? They're going to not necessarily as consistent as traits, like personality traits. They have a little bit more malleability. Your situations might change a little bit. For me, as I aged and I got a family and things just changed in my life situation, my values changed a little bit. But for the most part, they're relatively stable. So they're kind of in that middle ground. The other important part about values that I mentioned a second ago was that there's always a rank order. At least there should be a rank order, because when it comes down to it, they might sometimes come into conflict and you have to choose one or the other. So that's what I want to talk about here. So the first part of potential values conflict is intra-value conflict. So this is intra meaning within, right? So within what I value, there's a potential conflict. Sometimes it's instrumental versus another instrumental. Sometimes it's instrumental versus terminal. That seems to be a relatively popular intrapersonal value conflict. So perhaps I really have a strong value for honesty. I do not want to lie. I always want to do the right thing and be transparent with people. But perhaps I also really value prosperity. Well, what happens when you get into that situation where, you could kind of leave out some details because you don't want to turn a potential prospect off, which is going to help you be prosperous, right? You can picture this happening all over the place. So that's a great example of value conflict. You could also have value conflict within people, right? So you have a value and a team member has a value, or a supervisor has a value that also conflicts. So again, maybe you value honesty and your supervisor values prosperity. That's going to create a little bit of awkward conversation there on what's the right way to do things. You can also have what's called individual organizational value conflict. So this is the conflict between yourself and the entity that you are within, or the organization that you're within. So that can be problematic as well, because if you're within an organization that doesn't value the same things, that increases the likelihood you're going to turn over or want to leave or be committed. So ideally, on the organization side, you're bringing in people into the organization that genuinely value what the organization values as a whole, which could be framed essentially as their organizational culture. So a few things are kind of changing the ability to increase individual organizational value alignment. Number one is technology, because now you don't have to wait for a phone call to kind of piece apart and talk with somebody what exactly they believe in. We can post our values on the website. We can post some videos and show people, and they can see it, so that, if people are like, this really isn't for me. And also now we can email people, or we can see on LinkedIn who works at these different organizations. So we can ask them before we even apply. So that's helping. Another is that research is illustrating pretty clearly that you need to be conscious of what's called offering a realistic job preview. If you're not realistic as an organization about what your values are, and you're just selling the applicant on working for your organization, they're unhappy, they're likely to turn over, and that is expensive and costly. And now you don't have a person that you really needed to do whatever project it was. And then also is in this onboarding process, when somebody new comes to the organization, it's really important that you start establishing what the values are, so that if there are value differences, you can start to reconcile those and make sure that there's no issues going forward. So last but not least, let's take a step back. We talked about all these different individual characteristics. So what's the point? Like, who cares, right? Does it really matter that we all have different traits and different values and different tendencies and different intelligence levels? So what, right? We always got to ask that question after each module. So number one, if you understand your individual characteristics, you are going to have a higher likelihood of A, being satisfied within your work environment, and B, being a higher performer. And here's why. If you understand what you're good at, what your tendencies are, and what your strengths are, you can make sure that you're molding a work scenario that's going to work best for you, right? You can carve out whether or not you want to work alone or work with people. You can carve out the type of projects you work on. You can start asking to do and get involved in opportunities that allow you to align with your values, right? The more in tune you are with your individual characteristics, the higher likelihood you are of ensuring you're pushing forward and getting into the right situation for you. It's also going to be really important when we start evaluating things at the team level, okay? Teams are important, and we'll talk about teams later, because it ensures that you have synergy and you can create more than the inputs, right? When you have a team, it's more than just people, the individuals involved in that team. You can create something bigger because you're working together and you're fleshing out new ideas and new perspectives and compensating for people's strengths and weaknesses. But you're not going to be able to do that well unless you understand the differences between all of the people and how those all can come together to either supplement or complement each other. The better we understand ourselves, that we can communicate to other people how we operate so they know how to work with us. The better we understand all the parties that we're working with on our team, the higher likelihood we have of being able to adjust and accommodate to make sure they're comfortable, right? People work better together when they understand each other, when they appreciate each other's differences, and they're empathetic and they're willing to take perspectives, right? So understanding the individual characteristics of people is important for that. So this is offering a language for it. We're talking about what all these different categories are, right? Traits, values, intelligence, etc. And then we're also offering subcategories by being very specific on what those are, right? So for example, you have the 5 characteristics, or excuse me, the big 5 within traits. You have this entire list of values, and maybe you want to look at Schwartz's 10 values, right? So we're creating categories there. And then within those subcategories, then you get at the more specific items or specific questions that then bubble up to determine what those look like. So within extroversion, for example, that could be somebody that's sociable, somebody that's talkative, somebody that is re-energized by working with people. So again, it's about understanding the language to be able to put together this map of what all of these different terminologies mean so that we can have a conversation about individual differences. All right, that's it.